The earliest evidence we have of an illustrated edition of Aesop's Fables was published in 1484 by William Caxton, some 40 years after Gutenberg built his first printing press. Who actually created the woodcuts is unknown, but although they were fairly crude affairs by modern standards, they were considered a technological marvel in their day. Only a year later, a more graphically sophisticated edition was published in Naples by Francesco del Tuppo, created by another anonymous illustrator. A 1567 edition by Marcus Geerarts the Elder showed yet more improvement in the quality of both the images and their engraving, and by the time Wenceslas Holler's version of 1635 was published, composition, perspective, and more plausible anatomy were all evident in the images. His was also an early example of the use of anthropomorphic techniques in many of the animal characters featured. But despite the innovative nature of Holler's visualization, neither Francis Barlow's 1666 edition or François Chauveau's unsophisticated illustration of Jean de La Fontaine's verse translation 2 years later pursued the creative potential of humanizing the animal characters. And the same was true of both Jean-Baptiste Udry's precisely but fairly lifelessly engraved series in 1734 and the similarly disengaged edition published in 1818 by Thomas Bewick. And it wasn't until 1839, a full 2 centuries after Holler's version, that the full creative possibilities of giving animals human characteristics was used again with significant success. In that year, J.J. Granville's colossally influential version was published, and was another milestone on the illustrated journey of the fables. Not all the fables were about animals, but in Granville's visualization, many of those he featured in his illustrations were fully or partially clothed, and frequently shown walking on their hind legs. In 1857, Charles H. Bennett took his cue from Granville and imported the tales into a contemporary Victorian setting, making great use of anthropomorphic character work for social satire. And his visualization was popular enough to be reprinted several times with later versions in colour. As you might expect from someone of his stature, Gustave Doré's edition, published in the same year, was among the most arresting and skillfully engraved ever produced. His images employed a wide range of anthropomorphic effects, from hardly any through to clothed and upright, but they were all absolutely anatomically plausible, and the skills of his chosen engravers in achieving the remarkable tonal qualities of these images made his series a truly immersive and visually satisfying experience. 2 years later, in 1869, a similar collection was published by the lesser-known Ernest Griset. By this point, all the expected characteristics of modern illustration, with the notable exception of colour, were in evidence. And blending human and animal characteristics was by now both a widely accepted and immensely popular humorous device with the general public. In 1887, Walter Crane preferred to keep his animals naturalistic and deliberately emulated the more mannered offerings of earlier centuries. Firmly committed to traditional methods, he used both wood engraving and woodblock colour printing to make his decorative series. A year later, another less mannered version was created by Louis Maurice Boutet de Monvel. His illustrations were printed using desaturated chromolithographic colour, and they were set out in an early comic strip style sequential format. In 1894, a particularly distinctive edition of the Fables was published in France by a group of Chinese illustrators. Unfortunately, there's no information who these artists were, but although this series of delicate watercolours was conspicuously devoid of anthropomorphic stylization, it was an aesthetically pleasing interpretation of the narratives. A year later, Edouard Fosty produced an edition of the Fontaine verses in colour, which took moments from each fable and arranged them artfully to make visually engrossing layouts, which skillfully combined text and image. Towards the end of the 19th century, full-colour printing allowed artists such as Edward Detmold to simply paint in the medium of their choice, and his naturalistic 1898 edition was among the earliest examples to fully explore the creative freedom offered by this revolutionary process. Despite the growing popularity of full colour, others, such as Percy Billinghurst in 1899, continued to express themselves in monochrome. And of course black and white was far cheaper to produce. And his series was so skillfully rendered that the absence of colour barely made an impact on the engrossing aesthetic qualities of his penwork. In 1906, Benjamin Rabier picked up where Edouard Forstier had left off and created a more recognisably modern comic page format and technique. He used a graphic line and only minimally tonal colour, and his effortlessly comic humanised animal pictures and playful approach to page layout made this a significant signpost for later children's picture books. Arthur Rackham's 1912 edition was another which relied on varying degrees of anthropomorphism, and being Rackham, he handled the logistical challenges presented by the fables with consummate skill. By this point there was nothing new about employing this device, but Rackham used it to create characters which were remarkably plausible in anatomical descriptive terms, and yet were also clearly expressive of human behaviour. In 1919, the less well-known but still popular and talented Milo Winter created a lavishly and comically illustrated version using precisely the same by now widespread pen and watercolour technique as Rackham, but with a brighter, more saturated colour palette. A year later, Raymond de la Nazière developed what Benjamin Rabier had begun, with a series of images strongly suggestive of animation, using generally flat colours bound together with a bold but expressive black line. Although Harry Rowntree had earlier made his reputation creating particularly endearing anthropomorphic animal characters, his watercolour interpretation of the fables, published in 1924, generally relied on faithful depictions of animal anatomy. Only a year later, Takeo Takai published a version of the fables, and the collision of Eastern and Western visual cultures made for a particularly engrossing and distinctive series of images. He utilised a deceptively approximate linear technique combined with far from naturalistic flat spot colour, with a disregard for conventional draftsmanship not often seen in the West at this time. Felix Loriot's delicately executed comedic pen and watercolours published in 1929 could hardly have been more different. This was a significant and masterful series, which in many ways was the perfect combination of imaginative visual embellishment of the basic narrative and varying degrees of anthropomorphic illustration. Despite their obvious aesthetic beauty, they also employed a certain sardonic humour, and all these qualities combined to make it a memorable and enduringly popular edition. But beginning in 1930 with a series of woodcuts by Victor Stuyvesant, there seems to have been something of a revival of pre-full colour craft methods and intentionally backward-looking stylisation. Only a year later, Agnes Miller Parker published her skillfully engraved monochrome edition, and Stephen Gooden's version in 1936 deliberately mimicked the visual aesthetics of the 18th century, with a collection of illustrations created by highly descriptive use of steel engraving. In 1944, Henry Johnson produced a series of traditional colour lithographs. These illustrations would have been particularly complex and time-consuming to produce, but as with the others around this time, she exhibited a certain disdain for easier methods. Fulvio Bianconi's 1946 visualization was created conventionally enough with pen and watercolour wash, but nevertheless it was styled with disregard for conventional representation. And this trend continued with Fritz Cradle's calligraphic pen and ink drawings in 1947, and a series of particularly expressive woodcuts by Antonio Frasconi published in 1954. Joan Kittle Munro's 1961 edition was no less striking and combined flowing calligraphic line work with secondary spot colours with aesthetically pleasing results. The 1965 edition by Alison Martin Provenson was created in full colour, but painted with a visually absorbing and riotously expressionistic style not generally seen elsewhere in this period. And in 1970, Edward Borden published a series of limited edition coloured lino cuts, which deliberately used the medium's technical constraints to create a highly distinctive and decorative collection. But right at the other end of the stylistic spectrum, Jack Kent's 1974 version was a cheerful, modern and minimal cartoon visualization for young readers, featuring many deceptively simple, endearing characters, both human and animal. And in what was by now an undeniably postmodern environment where no dominant style prevailed, Heidi Holder's 1981 edition constituted a memorable return to the classical aesthetic values and painted prowess of the Golden Age. Ron Hamilton's 1985 illustrations, which combined Disney-esque levels of anthropomorphic character design with particularly controlled watercolour washes to create a highly enjoyable edition. And in counterpoint to this precision, a decade later in 1996, Charlotte Vogt defied the supposed dominance of digital image making with a series of engaging loose pen and watercolour illustrations. As the millennium drew to a close, in 1999, Don Daly's unapologetically traditional and skillful edition showed even greater disdain for the winds of change. And these were by no means exceptions. The 21st century got underway with an edition published by Jerry Pinkney in 2000, which was a similarly accomplished and aesthetically pleasing series of watercolours which greatly enhanced the fable's sparse text. And although more overtly comic in intent, in 2003, Brad Sneed also employed traditional careful application of bright transparent colour to create a series of highly entertaining images. Ayano Imai's 2012 visualization of the Fables was a highly distinctive series of mesmerizing paintings of remarkable aesthetic quality. Her haunting images largely ignored the humour others had exploited and focused instead on a more surrealistic and memorably unsettling quality. Chris Lench's 2015 edition was a surprisingly rare digital visualization of the Fables, and unless I'm mistaken, the only example in this video. The book was very much directed at younger children, and although suitably simple and flat in what had now become the norm for early learners, his modernist visualization was both humorous and absorbing. I'm not sure I could do better than with Charles Santori's 2018 edition to bring this video to a close. This was another enviably accomplished series of detailed and highly controlled paintings, which could best be described as the perfect symbiosis of text and imaginative engrossing imagery. In fact, the very qualities that have formed the backbone of narrative illustration since it began with Gutenberg's printing press 7 centuries ago.